Good afternoon to everybody in the room and on Zoom. We're going to continue our previous session on nonviolent resistance in modern times, but we're moving up on the timeline. My name is Deborah Shmueli, and I'm from the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law Under Extreme Conditions. Each of the speakers does have a bio on the conference website, so I'm just going to introduce everybody very quickly. And since we're a little late, I'm going to start right now. Our first speaker is Mark Freeman, who's the founder and executive director of the Institute for Integrated Transitions, which is a non-governmental organization that recently celebrated its 10th anniversary as a global peace-building innovator. Mark is a leading expert in political transitions and high-level peace negotiations, and he's worked all over the globe. His talk today via Zoom is The Nature of Polarization and Its Implications on Advancing Human Rights.
All right. I'm sorry I can't be there with you in person, but in any case, I'm very pleased to be part of this important conversation. And yes, it's a pleasure to be part of this panel as well. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to speak about polarization and human rights and how these also relate to questions or the place of resistance as a strategy to deal with challenges in societies and political systems. And I'm going to be making asking and then offering a tentative answer to three questions. One is what actually is polarization? What kind of problem is polarization? Second question I'll be looking at is the effect of polarization on human rights. And then the third question that I'll be looking at is related to how to deal with polarization, strategies for preventing or reducing polarization. The context for my talk is our organization, the Institute for Integrated Transitions. We're a peace-building organization, and as Deborah mentioned, we work generally at very high levels at different stages of peace negotiations in the design of the talks and creating the conditions for them, inside of the talks, and then also if agreements are reached in the implementation phase. One of the challenges we continuously deal with at the front stage, at the front end, is polarization. Polarization of different kinds, but again, particularly I'm talking about polarization of societies and polarization of political systems as an impediment to peace. We began 2 years ago a very large and very dynamic collaboration with the Ford Foundation, which it turned out was also thinking about polarization in its work, in its global work. Ford Foundation is a social justice philanthropy, and they were finding increasingly that organizations and movements that they supported globally were confronted with the same challenge, polarization that was impeding advances in social justice. And they were even concerned, some of them, at least some colleagues in our organization, and likewise but in particular in the Ford Foundation, expressed the concern that possibly some of the work of nonviolent resistance and movement building may have been unintentionally contributing to the polarization of societies and political systems, which in turn created, as I said, a vicious cycle in terms of the ability to advance social justice causes. So that's the context for why I'm speaking about polarization and human rights in my brief remarks today. So let me go now to the first question that I alluded to, which is what kind of problem is polarization? That's probably a question that some of you may be thinking, well, it's obvious what kind of problem polarization is. You could be right, but so far in our work, we've now carried out 2 years of convenings and research and interviews globally about polarization. And it turns out that there's not a whole lot of consensus about what polarization actually is. There are some people who think about it as a horizontal phenomenon, a kind of conflict that operates between two critical masses. Others think of polarization as a vertical problem, one that involves different forms of domination or aggression by one against another that produce polarization. Some people think polarization is a permanent state, that you're always in all societies and political systems, you're always on an index somewhere from 1 to 10 in terms of your level of polarization, but that it's permanent, just like conflict. Others think that it's something that's more specific, that you can enter and exit it. You're not always polarized. There are actually many other ambiguities which are examined in a paper that we recently put out. But the point I'm trying to make here is that polarization is not an area of much consensus at this stage, definitionally, what actually polarization is, how it works. And so what I'll do is just, offer here, for purposes of this conversation, our particular understanding of the essence of polarization, and it's based on these 2 years of work that we've done, and it's also based on just basic etymology. I mean, the word polarization has an etymological history as well. There's an intellectual history behind the term, and there's also practice. How people use the term also tells us something about how polarization is understood. So one key idea of polarization, what is polarization, is that, again, it's a root word, is poles. Poles are usually understood in a binary form. There's two poles that operate at a distance, that reside at a distance from each other. In that sense, polarization is not a concept of proximity of relationship or ideas. It's the opposite. It's distance of between poles in terms of ideas and actors. The other idea that's implicit in the idea of poles, which again is, of course, a root component of the word polarization, is that the idea is that poles have a certain critical mass. If the poles are really, really tiny, you wouldn't probably use the word poles. It would be something else, a different word. Would be more marginal. But the idea of poles as well is that they're somewhat large in size, and the idea is that the middle is smaller. But again, the key point I'm trying to allude to here is that polarization has something to do with poles, and poles implicitly involve distance and critical mass in terms of size. Polarization also, of course, involves the word polarized, or the verb polarize. And the idea here, with the way that polarization is understood definitionally, whether academically and the way it's used in practical terms, this has to do with the idea of a certain amount of radicalization. Polarized individuals, polarized actors are not, are not. If you could put it this way, I mean, I don't want to personalize this too much, but the idea is if you use the term polarized, you're not generally describing calm, tranquil individuals or groups. The idea is that there's a level of radicalization that's understood and implicit in the concept of polarized or polarizing. And the polarized, in the concept of polarization, polarized exists within poles. So you have polarized individuals or actors that exist within poles that are at a distance from each other. And this is the last part that I'll just share in terms of how we understand polarization, how we articulate it, and what it's informed by, is the idea of us versus them dynamics, and often that involve othering, in which there's these clear sort of in groups and out groups, in which there's a dynamic of romanticization of your in group and demonization of the out group. And again, in the most extreme cases, this can produce dehumanizing words and dehumanizing actions. So given my description of polarization, it shouldn't surprise you that I think this is a pretty bad thing. I wouldn't want to live in a society or be part of a political system that was polarized based on my definition of polarization. And I'll go one step further, which is in the paper that we published recently, we describe it as a hyper problem. And the idea is that given the traits or the hallmarks of polarization that I just described, and again, you can look at the paper to see this in more detail. I'm just synthesizing the argument here. Polarization is a hyper problem, which is defined as in the paper as a special category of problem, one that when it exists makes the ability or the capacity to resolve all other problems harder. And that has principally to do with the fact that polarization is, if you're in a state of polarization in your society or in your political system, it means you're in a state in which the capacity to persuade others of your views, sometimes within your in-group and more particularly in those in a so-called out-group, is almost non-existent or certainly extremely low. So all the other things that you might want to do or achieve, whatever issues you care about, whether it's the climate or human rights or economic development or whatever, all of them are made more difficult by the existence of polarization, a hyper problem. Again, that it's a problem, it's a special category of problem that makes the resolution of all other problems more difficult or more remote. So that's my way of answering the first question that I pose. What kind of problem is, what is polarization? What kind of problem is it? The second question that I'm going to ask and briefly answer is, what is the relationship between polarization and human rights? What are the effects of polarization on human rights? And here I'll be much more brief. I would argue that there are four principal effects, all of them negative in terms of human rights. A first effect is what I would call a legal or a legislative effect. If your society or your political system are in a state of polarization, you have gridlock. Your ability to legislate or to pass certain human rights reforms through laws and regulations and policies is significantly diminished. So that's a bad legal or legislative effect on human rights when polarization of society or political systems exists. A second bad effect for human rights when you have polarization of society or political systems is political effects. And here it's the point is that if you have polarization, then you are more likely, rather than less likely, you are more likely to develop authoritarian trends, or what a prior speaker mentioned. I only saw the last part, but the idea of sort of illiberalism. It becomes more likely when you have polarization, given the way that I defined it at the outset. It puts you on a pathway to curtailments of civil liberties. Polarization makes it more likely than not that you will be moving away from democracy and the rule of law and towards their opposite. A third effect of polarization on human rights is what I would call a social effect. And this is that polarization produces less tolerance in society, less tolerance in political systems. And after all, human rights aren't just written in books and laws. They're also meant to be internalized in populations. They enter into the values of individuals and societies and into the culture. And so to have a human rights culture is an important part, at least in my way of thinking about human rights. And polarization in that sense, again, is bad. It has negative social effects for human rights culture to embed itself. And then finally, there are security effects. And here, polarization, what I want to say is, what I'd like to argue is that when polarization of societies and political systems becomes particularly extreme, it presents security risks. In worst case scenarios, you can have wars, genocide, atrocities, severe violence of different forms. And again, it has to do with the way that I've explained polarization to operate in terms of its structural mechanics, its definitional parts. These security effects, again, are become more likely than not when you have polarization. And of course, those kinds of security effects are very bad for human rights. It goes without saying. So the final question, and this is where I'll wrap up, is in terms of the third question that I pose, which is what can be done about polarization? If polarization, as I've argued, is bad for human rights, how can you work on polarization in a direct way to help prevent or reduce polarization? Because in addressing interventions to polarization in its own right as a problem of its own kind, then you have a better chance of avoiding these negative human rights effects that I've described. And in our 2 years of work together with the Ford Foundation, we detected three basic and very prevalent areas of intervention globally. When you look across, we did a very elaborate mapping exercise in which we tried to see, again, at a global level, actors that were intentionally and explicitly working to prevent or to reduce polarization in their societies or in their political systems. And there are three categories of intervention. One of these is what we call in the paper fact and narrative interventions. So here the idea is that, there are a lot of actors in different societies and political systems that say, well, there are very bad narratives that exist in our society, bad social narratives, bad cultural or political narratives that are producing polarization, and we need to change the narratives about our society or political system that are, contributing to polarization. That idea of trying to shift narrative is very often connected to the idea that facts matter, that when you have disinformation and misinformation, it produces unhealthy or conflictual narratives. And so facts and narratives are often conflated in the actions that different actors undertake around the world. And again, the idea is if we can establish facts, clarify the facts, and work on narrative issues, changing the narratives to healthier narratives for our societies and political systems, then we have less polarization. A second major category of intervention is what we call structural reforms. So the idea is that polarization isn't just accidental, it's not arbitrary. There are structural factors, ecosystem factors, if you like, that make the ability of polarization to exist or to grow easier or harder. These can be everything from social media and internet regulations to the kind of legal reforms that may involve, for example, decentralization of power and certain kinds of security sector reforms. The idea, again, is there are electoral reforms. That polarization happens in part because of structural factors that make it easier or harder to polarize. And then the third major category, and this is where I'll conclude, is one that is perhaps the most intuitive and probably the most prevalent as far as we can detect, which is outreach and dialogue efforts. Outreach and dialogue efforts within the in-groups of polarized societies and political systems, and of course, outreach and dialogue to so-called out-groups, those in the other pole, if you like, as well as outreach and dialogue to people who are in neither pole, but perhaps somewhere in the middle. And I mentioned this particular at the end just because while it's sort of obvious that resistance naturally should form part of, let's say, a full and effective strategic response in many cases where there are actors who are intentionally polarizing societies and political systems in ways that produce those four bad effects that I described, those bad effects for human rights, among other things. Outreach and dialogue, I would say, aren't really forms of resistance per se. They have a very different logic. Outreach and dialogue is about consensus building. It is about listening. It is about many things that don't really fit within the category of resistance. But outreach and dialogue is of course a fundamental part of any response, any comprehensive response to the specific nature of polarization as a problem. So I'll stop there. But in any case, I look forward to the discussion, and I hope that this intervention will contribute to some of the reflections that will be happening over the next couple of days.
Mark, thanks so much. I look forward to hearing some examples of how you use this intervention if we have time later.